Ladies and gentlemen, as has already been alluded to, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation recognizes that leadership in our community, both at the individual level and in the not-for-profit community and private sector, are essential to the sustainability and vibrancy of our community, and to ensure that we are able to address any challenges we may face, and there will be challenges to come, and respond to the changes that the years ahead are sure to bring. The Foundation's strategic vision, as Melvin discussed, reflects a strong commitment to foster and encourage such leadership and civic engagement within our community. And I can assure you the board and staff are determined to do what we can do to cause such leadership and engagement to grow and to prosper in our community. And it is with this commitment in mind that it is my privilege today to introduce our speaker, Dan McGinn. Dan is the CEO and founder of McGinn & Company, based in Arlington, Virginia. During his 35-year career in communications, Dan has spent a great deal of time working with and advising leaders in the private and public sectors and in higher education, to name just a few areas. He has advised more than 40% of the Fortune 100 companies, including such household names as GE, IBM, 3M, General Motors, Johnson & Johnson, and Coca-Cola, just to name a few. And he has also worked with many leaders of various universities in our country, including Columbia, Emory, and our own WVU. Dan and his firm specialize in helping their clients solve complex reputation challenges, often providing advice to them in times of significant crisis when there are competing demands, conflicting storylines, and tight deadlines. In other words, when everything is just one huge mess. They call in Dan. Our program for today's event lists a few of these high-profile cases. As summarized on the McGinn & Company website, a guiding principle for the company is based on the simple idea expressed in a letter to John Adams, from Thomas Jefferson to John Adams in 1816, that opinion is power. Recognizing the importance of listening to and studying the opinions of others, over the past 25 years, Dan and his colleagues have conducted thousands of opinion research projects, engaging consumers in discussions on issues ranging from healthcare and the environment to political perspectives and sports interests. In addition to these traditional research activities, Dan and his firm are known for their study of and insights on popular culture, behavioral trends, and demographic changes, and are often called upon by individuals and businesses, not just in times of crisis, for advice on important societal shifts and how they should respond to such changes. In short, Dan has made a career of helping individuals and businesses navigate change, often change brought on by the unexpected or a crisis, but just as frequently in times where no immediate crisis exists, called upon by leaders who seek his guidance and advice in figuring it all out and determining the best path forward. Last but not least, Dan is a proud native of Nitro, West Virginia, a graduate of Nitro High School. Go you Wildcats. And he and his wife Debbie, who's here today, in addition to living in Arlington, have a home with their dog Gracie in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. Please join me in welcoming back one of our native sons, Dan McGinn.
Thank you, Charlie. Oh, that was great, but I promise you the Gracie reference will be the best received thing at my house. Becky, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Melvin, it's fun to be here. I talk about nitro and people laugh. So I graduated from Nitro in 1972. And it's, 43 years? Stunning. And the audience is Paul McClanahan. Paul, you have to stand up. This was my 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th grade civics teacher. Now, the problem I have is that Paul looks so much younger now and I look so much older. Paul's a big baseball fan, and I'm not saying, Paul, that any PEDs were involved here. I'm sure it's all natural that you've maintained your youth through all these years, but it was in Paul's class that I wrote a letter to my congressman, John Slack, and I proposed that I would come to Washington as a page. Now, I knew only what I had read. And that would have been when I was 13 or 14 years old. When I was 15, I persuaded my parents to drive to Washington to ask, so I could ask him for a job. Now, I didn't know about making an appointment. So I just showed up at the office. And now I think, what were they thinking? And they said, well, he's not here, but if you come back later, he'll meet with you. I came back later and he still wasn't there. And they said, well, we talked to him about you, and he said, if you want a job that bad, you can have one. And you can be a page. But you have to wait till you're 16. So I waited, and I left in 1972. I remember we went over to Silver Brand Clothes. Who remembers Silver Brand Clothes? Oh my God, am I a native here or what? And I got on one of the 6 airlines that had jet service to Washington from Charleston. And I paid $18 to fly to Washington. So what I want to do is I want to look back at the changes that have occurred in that period of time. I'm going to be self-indulgent and just time it around my era here. And then I want to look forward. It's 1972, where I was growing up on West 11th Street in Nitro. Every man worked at a chemical factory, right? Every mother stayed at home. Every man was a World War II veteran. Virtually all Democrats. And we got our news how? We could only get 2 stations. Where we lived in Nitro, you couldn't get ABC. We could get 2. And I would wait for the Daily Mail to be delivered around 4 o'clock. I'll tell you one quick story. I haven't always been so successful, Charlie, in my entrepreneurial career. I was a paper boy very briefly for the Charleston Gazette in the summer of 1969. And if you remember what happened in July of 69, we landed a man on the moon. And I was delivering papers at that time. And I overslept and didn't deliver the Gazette that morning. Probably the one day that everybody wanted their paper. I didn't make the paper that day. My wife will tell you I am absent-minded. No diversity in Nitro, all white town. I didn't know anybody of color. I didn't meet anybody. I didn't know anybody. I go to Washington. I'm 17 years old. I love to play basketball. I'd go on the streets of D.C. It was a different world. It was a wake-up for me. You shopped at local retailers. And now I come back and I tell this story. I spoke at Harvard a few months ago. And I showed them the pictures of Nitro. How do you go from a chemical industry, union members, Democrats, to a Toyota factory? How do you go from very conservative to a gaming institution? How do you go from all these little businesses to a Walmart? It is a period of unprecedented change. When I was in high school, you're going to think this is a crazy fact. Less than 5% of people were cremated when they died. We're approaching 50%. 40% of all Americans changed their religion in their lifetime at least once. How many of you had kids change their college and move? How many kids come back and live at home? These are forces of change, unprecedented. So I go to Washington in 1972. Nixon just went to China. China was this backward, closed society. In the spring of '72, he went, and John Slack, the congressman here, was in the first group to go after it. I remember he was so excited, and he came back here, and he had the Kodak carousel of all these pictures, and he would go to civic groups and show them what China looked like. I was on the House floor in June of '72, and I listened as members of Congress talked about, what do you think that break-in at the Democratic headquarters meant? 1972. The federal budget in 1972 was a little over $900 billion. The budget today is $3,900 billion. Barack Obama was 11. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, was still in Washington holding court at her house in DuPont Circle. In the congressional office where I worked, do you know what happened every morning? My God, I described this to my wife, and she said, they're going to think you're so old. I said, honey, I'm so old. The mail would come in every morning. And the women, and they were all women, would open the mail. And you would take the letter and you'd go across the room to a big card cabinet where 3x5 cards were there. Because everybody who wrote a letter had their own 3x5 card. And you would take the letter and you'd go through the 3x5 cards to see if that person was in there. And if they weren't, you made a 3x5 card for them. And if they were, you got the card and you attached it. And then you handed that to one of the caseworkers who spent all day working on that case. At the end of the day, they had a stack of letters. And the letters would go to another secretary who would read all the letters. And she'd find typos or mistakes, and she'd draw a line through it, and it would go back on their desk, and the next day they'd repeat it. And that was efficient constituent service. The other thing that happened at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, never forget it. 5 o'clock, what happened? You didn't have long-distance service during the day. Cost too much. So you had one phone in the congressional office. Look, this is not Abraham Lincoln I'm talking about here. You had one phone, rotary dial, sitting in a corner on top of a little table, and everybody lined up so they could call their cases in the district on the one phone that they had. I went downstairs in trying to think when it was, late 70s, 80s. I went downstairs and they had a representative from Motorola into the dining room of the House chamber, and I saw the first mobile phone. Oh my God. We were still landing men on the moon in 1972, and today we don't have any way to get anybody off the ground. If I'd said to you, from 1903 to 1927, we'll go from Wright to Lindbergh. From 1927 to 1969, we'll go from Lindbergh to Armstrong. But from 69 to now, we literally can't put a man on the moon. You wouldn't believe these things. I walked on the mall in 1972, and I saw protesters with a movie projector set up on the mall showing Viet Cong supportive movies because it was the middle of the Cold War. So you think of those changes. Warren Buffett, at his annual meeting, I thought just had a fabulous perspective. He said, look, He's always talked about the great investor Warren Buffett with Berkshire Hathaway.